And the fall and the call. The phone is finally face down beside you. The emails answered, the last fire extinguished for today. Your body knows it's time to rest, but your mind carries the weight of what you're building into these quiet hours. Tonight, as you settle into stillness, I want to share with you a story of someone who understood that weight perhaps better than most. A story that begins not with triumph, but with the kind of defeat that strips everything away and reveals what truly matters. It is June 1940, and France is falling. Picture, if you will, the roads of northern France choked with humanity, millions fleeing south in a great exodus of desperation. Families pushing handcarts piled with possessions, their faces etched with the particular exhaustion that comes not from physical effort alone, but from watching everything familiar crumble. The German war machine has swept across Europe with terrifying efficiency, and now it rolls through France like a grey tide, unstoppable. In government offices across the country, men in expensive suits debate surrender. They speak of pragmatism, of accepting reality, of the impossibility of continuing resistance. The weight they carry has become unbearable, and they choose to set it down. On June 17th, Marshal Philippe Pétain, the hero of the last war, addresses the French people over the radio. His voice carries the tremor of age and defeat. It is with a heavy heart that I tell you today that we must cease fighting. The armistice will be signed in days. France, the great republic, will be divided and diminished. The government will relocate to the spa town of Vichy, where officials will learn to bow to their conquerors. But across the English Channel, in the smoke-stained air of wartime London, one man refuses to accept this ending. Charles de Gaulle stands 6 feet 5 inches tall, a giant even by today's standards. His colleagues call him le connétable, the constable, though never to his face. At 49, he carries himself with the rigid bearing of a career soldier, his pale blue eyes holding an intensity that makes lesser men uncomfortable. He has spent his adult life thinking about war, writing about war, preparing for this war, and now, as France surrenders, he finds himself utterly alone. Just days earlier, he was Under-Secretary of State for National Defense, a junior minister in a government that no longer exists. He had argued passionately in cabinet meetings for continuing the fight, for moving the government to North Africa, for refusing to accept defeat. But the old men who led France were tired. They had lived through one world war and had no stomach for another. They looked at de Gaulle, this tall, awkward intellectual with his theories about tank warfare and mobile defense, and saw a dreamer out of touch with reality. On June 15th, de Gaulle flew to London for what was supposed to be a brief military consultation. As his plane lifted off from French soil, he could not have known it would be 4 years before he returned. By the time he landed at Croydon Airport, the government he served was already negotiating surrender. London in June 1940 is a city holding its breath. The evacuation from Dunkirk has brought hundreds of thousands of British soldiers home, but they left behind all their equipment on the beaches of France. Now Britain stands alone, and everyone knows the German invasion will come with the summer tides. Air raid sirens test their mournful wail each day. Windows are taped against blast damage. Children carry gas masks to school in little cardboard boxes. Into this atmosphere of barely controlled anxiety steps Charles de Gaulle, carrying nothing but his military uniform and an unshakable conviction that France has not truly fallen. Not yet. Winston Churchill receives him at Downing Street. The two men could hardly be more different. Churchill, the romantic warrior poet, with his love of cigars and brandy and stirring speeches. De Gaulle, the ascetic intellectual who neither drinks nor smokes and speaks in the measured cadences of a philosophy professor. But Churchill recognizes something in this austere Frenchman. Perhaps it is the quality he knows so well himself. The stubborn refusal to accept the unacceptable. The flame of French resistance must not die, de Gaulle tells Churchill in his careful English. It will not die. Churchill nods slowly. He understands about carrying impossible weight. For months, he has been the lone voice in British politics, warning about the Nazi threat, while his colleagues pursued appeasement. Now, as Prime Minister, he bears responsibility for an empire under siege. He sees in de Gaulle a kindred spirit, someone who will not bend when bending seems the only rational choice. "What do you need?" Churchill asks. Access to the BBC, de Gaulle replies without hesitation, "I must speak to France." And so, on the morning of June 18, 1940, Charles de Gaulle walks through the corridors of Broadcasting House in central London. The building buzzes with controlled urgency. Announcers prepare bulletins about the latest German advances. Technicians adjust equipment that will carry Churchill's defiant speeches to a world watching Britain's death struggle. De Gaulle is accompanied by a young woman who will play a crucial role in what follows. Elisabeth de Mirabel is 23 years old, the daughter of a distinguished diplomatic family. She has volunteered to serve as de Gaulle's secretary, though at this moment his organization consists of precisely two people, himself and her. She carries a small notebook and watches this towering, intense man with a mixture of admiration and bewilderment. What kind of person, she wonders, believes he can speak for France when France's own government has chosen silence? The BBC studio is smaller than you might imagine. A simple room with acoustic tiles on the walls, a microphone on a small table, a chair. Through the glass partition, engineers make their final adjustments. In a few minutes, de Gaulle's voice will be transmitted across occupied Europe, carried on radio waves that respect no borders, acknowledge no conquests. He sits at the small table and arranges his few handwritten notes. His uniform is perfectly pressed despite his hasty departure from France. His expression reveals nothing of what he must be feeling. The weight of presuming to speak for a nation, the audacity of defying not just the German conquerors, but France's own legitimate government. Elisabeth de Mirabel watches from the corner of the studio. Later, she will write about this moment, about the strange calm that seemed to settle over de Gaulle as the engineer counted down to transmission. She will describe how this man, who had every reason to feel overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he was attempting, instead seemed to grow more composed as the moment approached. The red light flickers on. Across the channel, in kitchens and cafes, in hidden radios throughout occupied France, people lean closer to their sets. They have heard Pétain's surrender. They know their government has chosen collaboration. But now, unexpectedly, comes another voice. The leaders who, for many years past, have been at the head of the French armed forces have set up a government. De Gaulle's voice is steady, measured, carrying the authority of absolute conviction. He speaks not as a junior minister or a military theorist, but as someone who has appointed himself the guardian of France's honor. This government, alleging the defeat of our armies, has approached the enemy with a view to cessation of fighting. In the studio, Elisabeth de Mirabel holds her breath. She understands that she is witnessing something unprecedented, not just insubordination, but the birth of an entirely new form of resistance. This is not a general rallying his troops or a politician addressing his constituents. This is one man, armed only with his voice and his refusal to accept defeat, declaring that France still exists. But has the last word been said? Must we abandon all hope? Is our defeat final and irremediable? The questions hang in the air of the small studio, but they echo across a continent. In farmhouses where families gather around contraband radios, in the hearts of soldiers who escape to Britain and wonder if they are cowards or patriots, in the minds of ordinary people who feel something die inside them when they heard Pétain's surrender. To all these questions, I answer, no. The word carries the force of absolute certainty, not the desperate no of someone denying reality, but the considered no of someone who sees further than others, who understands that what appears to be the end may actually be the beginning. As de Gaulle continues speaking, his voice gains strength. He talks of the British Empire, of American industrial might, of the global nature of this conflict. He reminds his listeners that France is more than the territory currently under occupation, that France is an idea, a commitment, a flame that can be carried by anyone willing to bear its weight. The broadcast lasts just 4 minutes. When the red light goes dark, de Gaulle sits back in his chair. Elisabeth de Mirabel approaches him, uncertain what to say. How do you congratulate someone for committing what amounts to treason against his own government? How do you acknowledge an act of such audacious hope? But de Gaulle simply nods to her and stands. There is work to do. A resistance to build from nothing, a nation to resurrect through sheer force of will. Outside Broadcasting House, London continues its anxious preparations for invasion. But something has changed. In 4 minutes, one man has transformed himself from a minor government official into the embodiment of French defiance. He has taken the weight of an entire nation's honor onto his shoulders and found he can bear it. Tonight, as your own burdens press against your tired mind, remember this moment. Remember that sometimes the most important battles begin not with armies or resources or even hope, but with one person's refusal to accept that defeat is final. The story of what Charles de Gaulle built from that single broadcast and how it changed not just France but the world is just beginning. A voice in the dark. The morning after that historic broadcast, de Gaulle wakes in a small room above the BBC offices on Portland Place. The weight you carry in your own life. Perhaps you know this feeling. That moment when you open your eyes and remember the magnitude of what you've committed to. The promises made, the path chosen, the point of no return crossed. He has slept perhaps 3 hours. Outside his window, London continues its peculiar dance of normalcy and preparation. Shopkeepers sweep their steps while sandbags line the streets. Office workers hurry past anti-aircraft guns positioned in Hyde Park, a city that has learned to function while holding its breath. But inside that modest room, something extraordinary has begun to take shape. The previous evening's broadcast has reached beyond the English Channel, beyond the German checkpoints and propaganda, into kitchens and farmhouses and hidden radios across occupied France. In villages where Wehrmacht trucks now patrol the streets that Napoleon once marched down in triumph, people have heard something they thought was lost forever, a French voice that refuses to surrender. The response is immediate, though scattered. A telegram arrives from a French businessman in New York, a letter from colonial administrators in Chad, a coded message from a resistance cell already forming in Lyon. These are not the grand gestures of established power. These are the tentative reaches of people who thought they were alone, discovering they are not. You understand this moment, don't you? When you first realized that what you're building, that others could see it too. That the vision living so intensely in your mind might actually exist beyond the boundaries of your own determination. It's terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. Churchill summons de Gaulle to Downing Street that Tuesday morning. The Prime Minister is already deep into his day, cigar smoke creating small weather systems around the war maps spread across his desk. The two men could hardly be more different. Churchill, the seasoned politician who has fought his way back from political exile through sheer force of will and circumstance. De Gaulle, the career soldier who has never held elected office, now claiming to speak for a nation that officially considers him a traitor. General, Churchill begins, his voice carrying that particular weight of a man who has learned to make decisions that will echo through history. Yesterday you asked for my support. Today I need to understand precisely what you intend to do with it. This is the conversation that will determine everything. Not just de Gaulle's future, but the shape of French resistance. The nature of the alliance against Hitler, the very question of whether occupied Europe will have a voice in its own liberation. Two strong-willed men, each carrying the weight of their nation's survival, each needing the other more than either cares to admit. De Gaulle's response is characteristically direct. Prime Minister, I intend to rebuild France. Not the France that surrendered last week, but the France that has never surrendered. The France that exists wherever French people refuse to accept defeat. It's an audacious claim. At this moment, Free France consists of exactly one general, a handful of staff officers, and whatever moral authority that single BBC broadcast might have generated. But Churchill, who has spent the last month watching his own nation stand alone against impossible odds, recognizes something familiar in de Gaulle's certainty. The agreement they reach is as pragmatic as it is historic. Britain will provide facilities, funding, and most crucially, access to the BBC's transmitters. In return, de Gaulle will coordinate French resistance efforts, provide intelligence from the occupied territories, and work to bring French colonies into the Allied cause. It sounds straightforward on paper. In practice, it will prove to be one of the most complex and fractious partnerships of the war. But today, in that smoke-filled room in Downing Street, both men understand they are creating something unprecedented. A government in exile that exists not in territory or treasury, but in the simple refusal to accept that defeat is permanent. The BBC becomes de Gaulle's lifeline to occupied France. Each evening at 9:15, after the regular news broadcast, a familiar voice cuts through the static and the jamming attempts. Ici Londres. Les Français parlent au Français. Here is London. The French speak to the French. Maurice Schumann, a young journalist who escaped from Paris just days before the German entry, becomes the voice of these broadcasts. Night after night, he sits before the microphone in Broadcasting House, speaking to an audience he cannot see, in a country he cannot reach, delivering messages of hope to people whose faces he can only imagine. Picture those listeners huddled around hidden radios in farmhouse cellars and apartment back rooms. The volume turned low, ears straining to catch every word over the German jamming signals. These are not passive recipients of propaganda. These are people making a choice. The choice to risk imprisonment or worse for the simple act of listening to their own language spoken by free voices. The messages are carefully crafted. Military intelligence woven into seemingly innocent phrases. Instructions for resistance activities disguised as cultural commentary. But underneath the coded language runs something more powerful. The persistent reminder that France continues to exist. That somewhere beyond the occupation, beyond the collaboration, beyond the daily humiliations of defeat, the true France endures. You know this feeling, don't you? Those moments when what you're building feels impossibly fragile. When the gap between your vision and your current reality seems unbridgeable. When you're sustained only by the belief that somewhere, somehow, others share your conviction that things can be different. De Gaulle understands that he is not just fighting for territory or even for political legitimacy. He is fighting for the idea of France itself, for the notion that a nation is more than its government, more than its military, more than its current circumstances, that a people's true character reveals itself not in moments of triumph, but in how they respond to apparent defeat. The weight of this responsibility settles on his shoulders like a familiar coat. Each morning brings new challenges. Vichy France denounces him as a traitor. The Americans question his authority. Even within his own small circle of supporters, there are doubts about his methods, his manner, his unwillingness to compromise on questions of French sovereignty. But each evening, when Schumann's voice carries across the channel, when coded messages confirm that resistance cells are forming, when reports arrive of French colonial governors choosing London over Vichy, de Gaulle knows that something irreversible is taking shape. Tonight, as you lie there with your own burdens, remember this truth that de Gaulle discovered in those first crucial weeks. Sometimes the most important work happens not in the daylight hours of meetings and decisions, but in the quiet moments when you choose, again and again, to continue believing in what you're building. Even when the evidence is thin, even when the obstacles seem overwhelming, even when you're not entirely sure how you'll bridge the gap between where you are and where you need to be. The voice in the dark, speaking to people who thought they were alone. This is how resistance begins. This is how the impossible becomes inevitable. Act, London, under fire. By the autumn of 1940, London had become something it had never been before, a city under siege from the sky. Every evening, as the sun disappeared behind the Georgian terraces and Victorian warehouses, the sirens would begin their mournful wail. Air raid wardens would emerge from their posts, checking blackout curtains, guiding people toward the underground stations that had become nightly sanctuaries. And in this city, transformed by war, a small community of French exiles found themselves living through something that defied easy description. They had fled one catastrophe only to find themselves in the middle of another. Yet perhaps this was exactly where they needed to be. Think about those moments when your carefully laid plans are swept aside by forces beyond your control, when the market shifts overnight, when regulations change without warning, when the very ground beneath your venture seems to shake. You know that feeling of watching your assumptions crumble while trying to maintain your footing, trying to keep building something meaningful in the midst of chaos. The French who had gathered around de Gaulle's call understood this intimately. They had lost their country, their certainties, their familiar rhythms of life. Now they found themselves in a London where the very act of survival required daily reinvention. There was a small café on Frith Street in Soho where many of them gathered. The owner, Madame Dubois, had been running the place since before the war, serving café au lait and croissants to homesick Parisians working in London's banks and embassies. Now her clientele had changed entirely. These were refugees, resistors, people carrying the weight of an entire nation's hopes on their shoulders. Every morning, she would unlock the door and set up the same small tables, arrange the same mismatched chairs. But the conversations that filled the air were unlike anything she had heard before. Plans whispered over coffee, maps sketched on napkins, letters written to families whose whereabouts remained unknown. The café had become a kind of embassy for a France that existed now only in memory and determination. Maurice Schumann would often stop by before heading to Broadcasting House for his evening transmission. You remember Maurice, the voice that carried de Gaulle's message into occupied France each night. But here, in the warm light of the café, he was simply a young man far from home, nursing a coffee that never tasted quite right, reviewing notes for another broadcast to people he couldn't see, couldn't reach, couldn't be certain were even listening. The weight he carried was different from yours, but perhaps not entirely unlike it. The responsibility of speaking for others, the pressure of maintaining hope when the evidence for optimism was thin, the daily choice to continue building something that existed more in faith than in fact. When the air raid sirens began their nightly song, the café would empty quickly. Madame Dubois would extinguish the lights, lock the door, and make her way to the nearest underground station. Down in the tunnels, pressed together with hundreds of other Londoners, the French exiles would continue their quiet work of resistance. They would share news gleaned from BBC monitoring reports. They would debate strategy in hushed voices. Sometimes they would simply sit in silence, each lost in memories of a Paris that now existed under German occupation, of families scattered across a continent at war. But something remarkable happened in those underground hours. The shared vulnerability, the common experience of waiting for the all-clear signal, it created bonds that mere circumstance could never forge. British families would share their thermos flasks with French strangers. Children would play games that transcended language barriers. Old men would compare notes about the sound of different aircraft engines overhead. You know how crisis can reveal the essential character of people, how pressure strips away pretense and shows you who truly stands beside you when everything else falls away. The London Underground, during the Blitz, became a laboratory for human resilience, a place where the act of simply enduring together became its own form of resistance. Above ground, the city absorbed punishment that would have broken lesser places. The docks burned night after night. Ancient churches crumbled under high explosives. Entire neighborhoods disappeared in clouds of dust and flame. Yet each morning, people emerged from the tunnels and began again. Shopkeepers swept glass from their doorsteps. Bus drivers navigated streets cratered by bombs. The BBC continued its broadcasts, its signal reaching across occupied Europe with messages of defiance. And in that rhythm of destruction and renewal, the French exiles found something they hadn't expected, a model for their own resistance. They watched ordinary Londoners refuse to be broken by circumstances beyond their control. They saw how communities could maintain their essential character even when their physical foundations were under assault. This became part of their message back to France. Not just military intelligence or political declarations, but something more fundamental. Proof that civilized life could continue even under the most extreme pressure. That dignity could survive bombing. That hope could persist in underground tunnels. That the act of gathering around small tables in Soho cafes was itself a form of victory. Madame Dubois would reopen her cafe each morning, sweeping away any glass that had fallen during the night, setting out the same small tables, brewing the same imperfect coffee. Her customers would return, carrying their maps and letters and whispered plans. The work of resistance would continue, one conversation at a time, one broadcast at a time, one small act of defiance at a time. You understand this rhythm, don't you? The daily choice to continue building when the foundations keep shifting. The decision to open your doors each morning despite the setbacks of the night before. The faith required to keep speaking your message even when you can't measure its impact. The French in London learned something during those months of fire and uncertainty. They learned that resistance isn't just about grand gestures or dramatic confrontations. Sometimes it's about maintaining the simple rhythms of civilized life when everything around you argues for despair. Sometimes it's about gathering around small tables and refusing to let the essential work stop. Sometimes it's about believing that somewhere, in the darkness, people are listening to your voice and finding in it the strength to continue their own impossible work. The cafe on Frith Street survived the war. So did the broadcasts. So did the community of exiles who refused to accept that their country had disappeared forever. What they built in those underground hours, what they preserved in those whispered conversations, it would prove stronger than any bomb that fell on London. Because what you build with others, in the face of uncertainty, with nothing but shared purpose and stubborn hope, that has a weight that can't be measured and a foundation that can't be shaken. Building free France. But building something from nothing, that's only the beginning of the weight you carry. Because once you've gathered people around a shared vision, once you've convinced them to leave behind what they knew for something that exists only in possibility, then comes the harder test. The test of keeping them together when the vision starts to take shape and everyone has a different idea of what that shape should be. By the autumn of 1940, de Gaulle was discovering this truth in the most painful way possible. The broadcasts had worked. Too well, perhaps. French colonies across Africa were declaring for free France. Resistance cells in occupied territories were looking to London for leadership. Exiles were arriving not just from France, but from across the empire. Engineers from Indochina, administrators from Morocco, naval officers from Madagascar. Each brought their own understanding of what they were fighting for. Each carried their own vision of what France should become when the war was won. And suddenly, the man who had stood alone in a BBC studio was surrounded by voices, all claiming to speak for the same cause, all pulling in slightly different directions. You know this moment, don't you? When your small team becomes a larger one. When the thing you started with a handful of believers begins to attract people with their own agendas, their own interpretations of the mission. When you realize that the clarity you had in the beginning, that beautiful simplicity of purpose, is about to be tested by the complexity of human ambition. De Gaulle would pace his small office in Carlton Gardens, reading reports that should have filled him with joy. A free French garrison had taken control of Chad. The governor of French Equatorial Africa had declared for the resistance. Ships were arriving in British ports, flying the Cross of Lorraine. But with each victory came new complications. The admiral wanted to prioritize naval operations. The colonial governors insisted on maintaining their administrative independence. The communist resistance cells demanded a voice in post-war planning. Everyone agreed on the goal, a free France. But no one could agree on what that meant or who should decide. And through it all, de Gaulle carried the impossible weight of knowing that he had no real authority over any of them. No official mandate, no democratic election. Nothing but the force of his own conviction and the fragile momentum of that first broadcast. He was building something unprecedented, a government that existed only in the faith of its followers, a nation that lived only in the hearts of its exiles. And every day brought new tests of whether that faith was strong enough to hold. The Americans didn't help. Roosevelt's administration viewed de Gaulle with deep suspicion. This self-appointed leader who seemed to embody everything they distrusted about European politics. They preferred to work with more compliant French figures, men who understood the value of compromise, who wouldn't make inconvenient demands about French sovereignty or post-war independence. The British were allies, but complicated ones. Churchill admired de Gaulle's courage, but found his pride exhausting. "The heaviest cross I have to bear," he once said, "is the cross of Lorraine." They supported Free France when it served British interests, but made it clear that France was now a junior partner in the alliance. Even within his own movement, de Gaulle faced constant challenges to his leadership. General Giraud, captured by the Germans but later escaped, commanded wider recognition among American officials. He was older, more experienced, more willing to defer to Allied priorities. Many in the French resistance saw him as a more practical choice for leadership. But de Gaulle understood something that his rivals missed, something that you, lying here in the quiet hours, might recognize from your own experience of building something against the odds. He understood that in times of crisis, people don't follow the most qualified leader, or the most diplomatic one, or even the most likable one. They follow the leader who embodies their own deepest convictions about what they're fighting for. And what de Gaulle embodied, what he refused to compromise on, even when it would have made everything easier, was the idea that France was not defeated, not diminished, not a country that needed to earn its way back to respectability through good behavior and grateful cooperation. France was a great nation temporarily occupied by its enemies, and great nations don't negotiate the terms of their own liberation. This wasn't arrogance, though his critics called it that. It was something more fundamental. The recognition that what you're building, the weight you carry, can't survive if you compromise on the core truth that makes it worth building in the first place. Every meeting with Allied officials became a test of this principle. Every negotiation about military operations, every discussion of post-war arrangements, every seemingly minor question of protocol, all of it came down to the same basic question. Would Free France accept the role of grateful supplicant, or insist on its place as an equal partner in its own liberation? De Gaulle chose equality even when it meant isolation, even when American officials threatened to cut off support, even when British allies suggested he was being unreasonable, even when members of his own movement urged him to be more flexible, because he had learned what every builder of something meaningful eventually learns, that the moment you compromise on what makes your vision unique, you begin the slow process of building something ordinary instead. The resistance cells in occupied France understood this, even when the politicians in Washington and London didn't. The weekly broadcasts from Maurice Schumann carried not just information and encouragement, but something more precious. The voice of a France that had not bent the knee, had not accepted defeat, had not agreed to be reasonable about its own subjugation. And slowly, through the autumn and winter of 1940, through the spring of 1941, something remarkable began to happen. The various factions and competing voices within Free France, they began to coalesce around this central truth. Not because de Gaulle forced them to, but because they recognized it as the thing they had all been searching for. A vision worth the weight they were carrying, a future worth the risks they were taking. A France that would emerge from this war not as a rescued victim, but as a nation that had never stopped fighting for itself. The unity wasn't perfect, the politics remained complicated, the Americans continued their suspicions, the British their conditional support. But something had been established in those difficult months, a foundation that could bear the weight of what was to come. Because what you build in those testing moments, when everyone is pulling in different directions and the easy path is to compromise your way to consensus, that's when you discover whether your vision is strong enough to hold, whether the thing you started in solitude can survive the complexity of community, whether what you're building is truly worth the weight you carry. Turning tides. By November 1942, something was shifting in the air of wartime London. The Free French gathered in their familiar haunts, the Soho Café where cigarette smoke still curled toward water-stained ceilings, the basement offices where maps of France covered every wall. But now there was a different quality to their conversations. A quickening. The wireless crackled with news that seemed almost too good to believe. Allied forces were landing on the beaches of North Africa. Operation Torch, they called it. American and British troops establishing footholds in Morocco and Algeria. And for the first time since that desperate June evening when de Gaulle had stepped before the BBC microphone, the war was moving in their direction. You know that feeling, when you've been carrying something heavy for so long that you've forgotten what it feels like to set it down. When you've been walking uphill in darkness for months, and suddenly there's the faintest suggestion of dawn on the horizon. Not daylight yet, but the promise of it. Maurice Schumann's voice carried new energy as he prepared for his evening broadcast. The words he would send across the channel tonight would speak of Allied victories, of French forces fighting alongside British and American troops in the desert campaigns. After 2.5 years of resistance built on faith alone, they finally had victories to report. In the underground shelters during the Blitz, the French exiles had learned to measure hope in the smallest increments. A successful sabotage operation reported from Lyon, a German convoy delayed in Normandy, resistance networks growing stronger in the shadows. But this was hope measured in divisions and beachheads, in territory reclaimed and enemies retreating. De Gaulle himself seemed to walk with different bearing through the corridors of Carlton Gardens, still that same austere figure, still carrying the weight of France's honor on his shoulders. But now there was vindication in his step. The vision he had declared from nothing more than moral authority. It was taking shape in the world. The Free French forces, no longer just symbols but actual fighting units, were proving themselves in the North African campaigns. French soldiers who had escaped from metropolitan France, colonial troops who had rallied to the Cross of Lorraine, volunteers who had made their way to London through Spain or across the Mediterranean. They were writing France back into the war with their courage. Think about those moments in your own journey when the tide begins to turn, when the thing you've been building in obscurity finally starts to show itself to the world, when the vision that lived only in your mind begins to take concrete form. There's a particular quality to that hope, deeper than optimism, more solid than wishful thinking. It's the hope that comes from seeing your judgment validated. Not just your dreams, but your assessment of what was possible when others said it wasn't. Your refusal to accept the easy answers when everyone else had already moved on to the next thing. In the cafe on Greek Street, the conversations had a new texture. Where once they had spoken in hypotheticals, when France is liberated, after the war, now they spoke in specifics. Plans for reconstruction, debates about the political future, arguments about how to rebuild what had been broken. These were good problems to have, the problems of people who could finally see a path forward instead of just maintaining resistance. The problems of builders rather than just survivors. But de Gaulle understood something that perhaps the others were only beginning to grasp. Victory in North Africa was just the beginning. The real test wasn't whether they could survive in exile or even whether they could contribute to Allied success. The real test was whether they could return to France as liberators rather than as rescued refugees. Because there's a difference between being saved and saving yourself, between having your vision validated by others and proving it true through your own actions, between being invited back to the table and earning your seat through what you've built. The Americans, flush with their success in North Africa, were already making plans for the administration of liberated France. Plans that assumed French incapacity. Plans that treated France as territory to be managed rather than as a nation to be restored. Plans that would have made de Gaulle's entire struggle meaningless. This was the paradox of success. Each Allied victory brought liberation closer, but it also brought the risk that France would be liberated by others rather than liberating itself, that the Free France movement would become a junior partner in its own resurrection. You might recognize this tension in your own work. The moment when what you've built starts to attract attention, when others want to help or to take over, when success brings new challenges that are more subtle but no less dangerous than the original obstacles. De Gaulle's response was characteristic. He doubled down on French independence. As Allied plans for post-liberation France grew more detailed, his insistence on French sovereignty grew more absolute. He would accept Allied support, but not Allied control. French forces would fight alongside British and American troops, but under French command when possible. It was a delicate balance: push too hard for independence and risk being cut out entirely. Accept too much assistance and risk losing the thing you'd been fighting to preserve. The winter of 1942 brought more good news. The German advance had been stopped at Stalingrad. The Africa Corps was in retreat. Resistance networks across occupied Europe were growing bolder. The war that had seemed lost was becoming winnable. But for the French exiles in London, victory was no longer just about defeating Germany. It was about the terms of that defeat. About who would be sitting at the table when those terms were negotiated. About whether France would emerge from the war as a restored great power or as a grateful client state. In the quiet moments between the public victories and the private planning sessions, de Gaulle must have felt the weight of what he had set in motion. That evening in June 1940, when he had spoken into the BBC microphone, he had claimed to speak for France. Now, 2.5 years later, that claim was being tested not just by German opposition, but by Allied success. The resistance he had called for was working. The Free France movement had grown from a handful of exiles to a functioning government in exile with military forces, diplomatic recognition, and administrative structures. The vision was becoming reality. But reality, as you know, brings its own burdens. When you're building something in the dark, you can focus entirely on the building. When it starts to work, you have to think about what success actually looks like, about whether the thing you've built can survive its own triumph. The French exiles gathering in their London haunts that winter were no longer just keeping hope alive. They were preparing to go home, not as returning refugees, but as representatives of the France that had never surrendered, as keepers of the flame that had been lit in a radio studio and tended through the darkest years of the war. The tide was turning, but the real work, the work of proving that their vision of France was worthy of the sacrifices that had sustained it, that work was just beginning. Because sometimes the hardest part isn't surviving the darkness. Sometimes it's making sure that what you've built in the darkness can flourish in the light. The dawn of liberation. By June of 1944, the weight you carry, it shifts. What had been the crushing burden of survival becomes something else entirely, the burden of possibility. The morning of the 6th dawned grey and uncertain across the English Channel, but in the offices and safe houses where the Free French had sustained their vision through 4 years of exile, there was electricity in the air, the kind that comes when everything you've built in shadow is about to step into sunlight. De Gaulle stood at his window overlooking London, watching the city that had sheltered his impossible dream. Somewhere across that stretch of water lay the beaches of Normandy, and beyond them, France. Not the France that had surrendered, but the France that lived in the hearts of those who had refused to accept defeat. The landings succeeded, wave after wave of Allied forces establishing footholds on Norman sand. But for de Gaulle, this was more than military victory. It was vindication. Every broadcast from that cramped BBC studio, every gathering in smoke-filled rooms where exiles had planned and argued and dreamed, every moment of refusing to accept that France was finished, all of it had led to this. You know this feeling, don't you? When the enterprise you've nursed through its darkest hours finally begins to prove itself to the world. When the vision that lived only in your mind starts taking shape in reality. But with that vindication comes new weight, different weight. De Gaulle understood this. As reports flooded in from the beachheads, as the momentum built toward what everyone knew was inevitable, he faced a challenge more complex than mere survival. How do you return to a country that has lived 4 years under occupation? How do you bridge the gap between those who fled and those who stayed? Between those who resisted and those who's accommodated? The France he was preparing to reclaim was not the France he had left. It was scarred, divided, suspicious. Some would see him as a liberator, others as an opportunist who had spent the war in comfortable exile while they endured the daily humiliations of occupation. Maurice Schumann, still broadcasting nightly to occupied France, found his messages changing. No longer just calls to resistance, but preparation for reunion. For the delicate work of healing a nation that had been broken not just by defeat, but by the terrible moral compromises that survival sometimes demands. In the Soho cafe where French exiles still gathered, conversations grew more complex. Stories filtered back from the continent. Tales of collaboration and resistance, of ordinary people making extraordinary choices, of communities torn apart by impossible decisions. The simple clarity of exile was ending. The messy complexity of homecoming was beginning. This is what success looks like, isn't it? Not a clean victory, but the opportunity to face new challenges. More sophisticated challenges, the kind that require not just the courage to survive, but the wisdom to build something lasting from what you've preserved. De Gaulle had kept the flame of French independence alive in a radio studio. Now he had to kindle it into a fire that could warm an entire nation back to life. The hardest part wasn't behind them. The hardest part was just beginning. But they were ready for it, because they had learned something invaluable in the darkness. They had learned that what matters most isn't whether the path is easy, but whether what you're building is worthy of the weight you carry. A return to Paris, and on the 25th of August, 1944, Charles de Gaulle stepped onto French soil once more, not as the unknown colonel who had fled 4 years earlier, but as the voice that had refused to let France die. The streets of Paris erupted in celebration as word spread that the general had returned, that the man who had spoken from London through the darkest nights was finally home. The weight he carried now was different. Not the desperate weight of a nation's last hope, but the profound weight of a promise kept. As his convoy moved through the liberated streets, past buildings scarred by occupation but still standing, past faces that had listened to his voice on hidden radios for 4 long years, he understood that this moment belonged not to him alone, but to every person who had refused to accept defeat. The bells of Notre Dame rang out across the city, the same bells that had fallen silent when the Germans marched in. Now they sang again, a sound that carried across the Seine and beyond, reaching into every corner of France where people had waited and hoped and held on. In London, Maurice Schumann prepared for his final broadcast to occupied France. The microphone that had carried so many messages of resistance would now carry news of liberation, the studio where they had built their movement of hope, where they had transformed exile into purpose, had served its greatest function. The voice of free France could finally come home. But the true victory wasn't in the parades or the celebrations, it was in the quiet moments, in the recognition that what they had preserved in exile was now flowering again in French soil. The cafes of Soho had been practice for the cafes of Paris. The community they had built among strangers had become the foundation for rebuilding a nation among family. As de Gaulle walked down the Champs-Élysées, surrounded by crowds who had endured what he could only imagine, he carried with him the lessons learned in those London rooms. That resistance begins with refusing to accept the unacceptable. That leadership sometimes means standing alone until others find the courage to stand with you. That what you build in darkness, if built with integrity, can withstand any light. The French exiles who had gathered in that Soho cafe, who had shared their fears and hopes over simple meals, who had maintained their dignity when everything argued for despair, they had learned something that would serve them far beyond the war. They had learned that exile is not about where you are, but about whether you remember who you are. Some would return to France immediately, carrying with them the perspectives gained in foreign lands. Others would remain in London, having discovered that home is not always where you were born, but where you choose to build something meaningful. All of them had been changed by the experience of losing everything and discovering what could not be lost. The weight you carry tonight, the responsibility that keeps your mind turning when your body begs for rest. It shares something essential with what de Gaulle carried through those London years. It is the weight of refusing to let something important die, of holding space for what others cannot yet see, of maintaining faith when evidence argues against it. But here, in this story's ending, we find something that speaks to the deepest part of your journey. De Gaulle's return to Paris was not the end of his challenges. It was the beginning of new ones. The liberated nation needed to be rebuilt. Former enemies needed to become fellow citizens again. The simple clarity of resistance needed to transform into the complex work of governance. Yet he was ready for it. Not because the path ahead was easy, but because the years of exile had taught him what could be endured, what could be preserved, what could be built even when everything seemed impossible. In the quiet of this moment, as your own day's weight begins to settle, let yourself feel the connection to that longer story. The challenges you face, the impossible deadlines and difficult decisions, the weight of others' livelihoods and dreams resting on your choices, they are part of a tradition that stretches back through every person who has ever refused to let something important fail. The Stoics understood this, that we are not the first to carry such weight, and we will not be the last. That there is honor in the carrying itself, regardless of how heavy the load becomes. That what we build, if built with integrity, becomes part of something larger than ourselves. Tonight, as your mind begins to release its grip on tomorrow's agenda, as your breathing deepens and your thoughts begin to drift, remember that the work you do, the weight you carry, the thing you are building, it matters in ways you may never fully know. Just as those French exiles could not have imagined, in their darkest London nights, that they were preserving something that would help rebuild a nation. You cannot know the full impact of what you preserve, what you protect, what you refuse to let fail. And so let yourself rest now, knowing that the weight will be there tomorrow, but knowing too that you have learned, as they learned, that what matters most is not whether the path is easy, but whether what you are building is worthy of the weight you carry. And tonight, in the quiet space between waking and sleep, Let yourself feel the truth that has sustained every person who has ever carried such weight, that you are stronger than you know, that what you are building matters more than you realize, and that the story you are writing, one difficult day at a time, is part of something beautiful and enduring and worth every moment of the weight you carry. And now, let that weight settle, let your breathing deepen, and let yourself rest in the knowledge that tomorrow, whatever it brings, you will be ready for it, just as de Gaulle was ready, just as they all were ready, because the darkness had taught them, had taught you, what could not be broken, what could not be lost, what would always, always be worth fighting for.